Thanks so much for the kind introduction, Chris, and thank you to our hosts and for everybody for joining us today. We're going to talk about the proliferation and growing strength of non-state actors, which in many ways is not new if you think back to the Cold War, when the US and the Soviets sponsored various competing proxy groups, or a group like Lebanese Hezbollah, which has been around since the early 1980s. But they are growing in strength with access to various emerging technologies. And it does seem that they are proliferating as states seek to fulfill their foreign and security policy objectives through using various proxies and private military companies. We're very lucky to have some of the world's leading experts on a range of terrorist, insurgent, and militia groups, and we're going to get into that a little bit here today. Whether it's Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, the so-called Axis of Resistance, the Wagner Group, or various far-right extremists, there are no shortage of adversaries aligning against the United States and Western interests. So we're going to open up with Nathan. We'll go down the line to get an overview of some of these various non-state actors, and then we'll peel back the onion a little bit and get into some more discussion.
Well, thanks, Colin, for moderating this discussion. I'd like to thank the Soufan Center for organizing this conference, and of course, a special thanks to Qatar for making this week's festivities, this week's conversations possible. I guess the first thing I would say about non-state actors is that very often non-state actors are not non-state actors. They're actually proxies, or if not a full proxy, a partner in service to some state actor that's pursuing its malign objectives. And states find it useful to hide behind a variety of militia groups, private companies, terrorist organizations, and so on. The best known examples, there's two states that have really perfected the dark arts of hiding behind so-called non-state actors, and that's, of course, the Islamic Republic of Iran, as well as Russia. When it comes to Russia, we've seen the Kremlin use groups like Wagner across Africa. We've seen Wagner active in Libya, in Chad, in various other places, purportedly performing a counter-terrorism mission, but actually pursuing the Kremlin's strategic objectives. Oh, and by the way, typically massacring villagers and expropriating massive amounts of wealth and natural resources in the process. The little green men that we saw invading Ukraine in 2014, parts of Donbass and Crimea, are another good example of the Kremlin's use of purportedly deniable proxies to pursue its strategic objectives. But I think even the Kremlin's efforts really pale in comparison to what we've seen from the Islamic Republic over the decades. It starts with Hezbollah in Lebanon, but it certainly doesn't end there. A wide array of terrorist groups across the Middle East region, and indeed active across the entire globe, have all the hallmarks of Tehran's puppet strings manipulating them. Hezbollah, of course, is the best known, but in Yemen you have the Houthi rebels serving as a vanguard for the mullahs. In Iraq, numerous militia groups that receive weapons and training and financing and strategic direction from Tehran are active, carrying out terrorist attacks against U.S. soldiers, U.S. diplomats, coalition forces, and so on. Then, of course, there's Hamas. And let me pause, not to dwell on this point for too long, but I think it bears emphasizing, because over the past several days we've heard a lot about the war in Gaza and the civilian suffering in Gaza. That is a concern that I share, and I want to see civilian suffering minimized to the maximum extent possible as this war proceeds. But it's important to remember how this war started. It started because Hamas broke the ceasefire that was in place on October 7th and launched waves of terrorists into Israel to commit massacres on a scale not seen since the Holocaust. 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians, were murdered, were burned alive, were raped, were mercilessly slaughtered. And that is how we got to where we are today. And it's important also to understand that Hamas's attacks on October 7th, like its broader campaign of terror against Israel and other enemies of the Islamic Republic, happened because of the Islamic Republic. Over the years, Tehran has provided hundreds of millions of dollars a year to Hamas and to other terrorist groups threatening Israel as part of a strategy of a circle of fire. So the question then becomes, why is it that countries like Russia, why is it that countries like Iran find it advantageous to use these proxies to promote their interests? I want to suggest it's a strategy of cost avoidance. It is a way for these regimes to externalize onto other actors the costs that they would otherwise bear for their belligerency, whether that's economic costs in the form of sanctions, military costs in terms of military retaliation, or whether it's reputational costs or diplomatic costs that they would have to bear in the course of their engagements with other states. If you've got Hezbollah to take the heat, you don't have to take the heat yourself. So if that's what's going on here, if this is all really about, or at least partially about, cost avoidance, that should inform the policy response to the phenomenon of non-state actors being used by states. And the most important thing that countries like the United States and Qatar and others can do is to reject the premise that the proxies are actually independent actors and acting on their own. Rather, the policy response has to begin from the presumption that we will hold accountable the state that set this in motion. We're not going to indulge the fantasy, which the state sponsor would like us to indulge in, that these are purely uncoordinated, independent uprisings or actions by private entities. No. We're going to call your bluff, and we're going to hold you responsible. Now, of course, what specific steps you take to hold a state responsible will be highly contingent upon circumstances. Sometimes a diplomatic response will be called for. Sometimes a kinetic response will be called for. If terrorist militias are killing American soldiers, you want to hold the terrorist militia responsible kinetically, but maybe you don't want to stop there. Maybe you also want to use kinetic options to hold responsible the Quds Force commanders who are providing them with weapons and equipment and training and direction and control. Anyway, I'll stop there. We've got a lot of ground to cover, but I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. I think I'll focus my comments here towards the end of today's sessions to talk a little bit with you about both the commonality between the financial operations of the Iranian-backed terror networks and those that the Russian Federation fields and deploys in the form of private mercenary-type companies. They both have one key thing in common, which is a high level of state funding. So when you talk, for instance, about Hamas, we're talking about a group that receives from the IRGC a couple $100 million a year in direct financing. Hezbollah, the favored of the terror groups that the Quds Force backs, receives upwards of $800 million or more in terms of direct financial support from the regime. In the case of the Wagner Group, or its various branches and affiliates that operate now widely across Africa, Vladimir Putin himself has acknowledged providing around $1 billion a year to that Russian paramilitary organization. Both of these networks also receive a high level of support from their respective government regimes in terms of weaponry, in terms of direct intelligence support that is provided by, in the case of the Iran terror apparatus, the Quds Force, and in the case of Wagner with the GRU, the military intelligence organization. In fact, the GRU has now stepped in to take over operations of Wagner in Libya. And they also provide significant training and logistics support. Both networks also engage in independent revenue generation. Now, in the case of Hamas, we're talking about a network of shell companies, but an actual investment office, formal structure that the Shura Council of Hamas operates with real estate holdings, they issue shares in various companies, and these holdings stretch from Algeria and Sudan into Turkey, the UAE, other places as well. And that network is estimated by the Treasury Department to be worth $500 million or more. Hezbollah operates in a slightly different model. They have Al-Qaeda al-San, which is the shadow banking structure that they use, and they have far-flung investments across Africa, particularly West Africa, where they're very heavy into cash-intensive businesses like fish farming. They're very, very active in the tri-border area in Latin America, where it's a customs evasion kind of scheme that they're profiting from. They're deep into Venezuela now. And these revenues, again, in part, are funneled back to Lebanon into Nasrallah's coffers. Where these two groups really do begin to differ, though, is in the intent of the Russian PMCs, I'll use that term for short, to seize and hold territory. This is not really something that the so-called axis of resistance has focused on. Obviously, Darya in Lebanon is a no-go zone for Americans, but here I'm talking about the way that when Wagner moves in, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about the Central African Republic or we're talking about Mali or Sudan or the DRC, Wagner will move in very often starting with the provision of military support, maybe in the case of the CAR, to prevent an attempted coup. But that quickly transitions into concessions that are granted to the Russian mercenaries, and really where the Russians really do favor is natural resources. So you see the Russians operating now increasingly across Africa, particularly the Sahel, North Africa, Libya, where they are focusing on oil concessions. And as I mentioned, they're flowing into Libya in a major way now. We haven't seen, in fact, the kind of influx into Libya of Russian mercenaries that we're now witnessing in support of Haftar, but probably in an effort to drive on towards Tripoli. In other places, like I mentioned, the Central African Republic, the focus has been on maybe three areas, principally gold. They have concessions with gold mines that are estimated to be in total net value of in excess of $1 billion. They also have won timber concessions to strip the rainforests, and they're generating about $1 billion a year there. And then precious gems and so on, particularly diamonds. Hezbollah does a little bit of this. For instance, in the DRC, key Hezbollah financiers have gotten a chokehold over bread production and have extorted local populations with bread prices. But the Russians favor the use of violence and the promotion of civilian casualties to then lead to forced labor, corruption, and they create, in essence, a zone of control where even in the Central African Republic, the government itself, no one can trespass without Russian permission. In general, the Iranian-backed groups don't and are seldom required to repatriate money back to the regime in Tehran. This was not the case for a brief period of time during the Trump administration when we had such a stranglehold on terror financing that, in fact, we saw Qasem Soleimani canvassing Iraqi militias, asking them to start sending funds back because they were running short in the terms of the Quds Force apparatus, and they were having to do things like elaborate oil smuggling mechanisms, the al-Shwiki network through Syria and so on. But generally speaking, Iran doesn't ask for that money back. Moscow does. Moscow expects a significant portion of what the Wagnerite-type PMCs are generating to go back to Putin, as well as for the Wagnerite groups to use these zones of control that they've established. They empty out prisons, they train African mercenaries, and they're now sending them to the front in Ukraine into the meat grinder. And so I think, pause there. I'm happy to talk more specifics, but I wanted to give you a bit of similarities and differences in the structural approach that these groups use for financing. The final point being, you can see quite well, while the Iranian financial support to its terror networks is substantial, the money that is washing around in the Russian paramilitary structures in Africa by far exceeds what we're talking about in the case of Iran. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, everyone, for being here for the last panel of the day. Really appreciate it. And always thank you, Colin, for moderating. So in my own work, I focus on different dimensions within the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. But today I will focus my remarks primarily on Islamic State Khorasan, also a group which I have been studying for over 7 years. And as you may have heard during the course of the day, it is becoming a great concern for international security, not just for the region. So what I want to do today is just contextualize ISK, which is also referred to as ISIS-K, ISKP. So just know when I say ISK, I am meaning to say ISIS-K, or referring to the same group. It seems like we hear news coming out about ISK every single day. So my goal today is really just to contextualize ISK's trajectory within the region, but also contextualize some of the prominent attacks, such as in Moscow and Iran recently this year, which have been linked to Islamic State Khorasan, which may have surprised many. And I just want to sort of contextualize what that means for ISK and its strategic adaptation given its current dimensions. I think it's always helpful to set the background when it comes to South Asia because, to say the least, it's a very complicated and complex landscape. So we have a wide variety of groups. We definitely have state-sponsored groups there. We have sectarian groups. We have anti-government Islamist groups and also ethno-nationalist groups. And finally, we have the transnational brands, which we're all familiar with, such as Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. Now, many of these groups are a product of proxy warfare historically, but a lot of them are also linked in one way or another to ongoing rivalries between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but also more prominently countries like Pakistan and India. And I think sometimes these rivalries and interstate relations come in the way of developing a unified counterterrorism response. Alongside what we see across South Asia are a lot of populations which are under repressive regimes, and there's not really a focus on development. What this does is create aggrieved communities, which then groups like ISK can easily exploit and sell their narratives to. So we're at the position now where the US has withdrawn from Afghanistan. It's been over 2 years, and we've had the Taliban regime in place. The two groups, at least the ones that I study, where we've seen a notable resurgence, one is ISK, but also the Pakistani Taliban, also known as TTP, or Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. So within this larger context, how do we make sense of ISK's trajectory? And what are some of the key factors that we should be attentive to? So since the Taliban's return to power in late 2021, ISK has really focused on exploiting 4 key elements. The first one is obvious. There's no longer an international unified counterterrorism presence there. The Taliban are obviously facing governance challenges, regardless of how they may sort of portray the narrative, which ISK readily exploits. Again, as I mentioned, we have populations which have deep grievances, right? And they are living under repressive regimes, which again makes them vulnerable to violent extremism. And finally, I think maybe perhaps this point is underappreciated, is that the transition of the Taliban from an insurgency to a state actor has almost left this power vacuum within the jihadist ecosystem. And ISK has really positioned itself, its propaganda and its other activities, to really serve as the central node which other militant factions can align with. And it has been successful at that, which has underpinned its growth and survival, at least in recent years. So when we look at ISK's traditional strongholds, so Afghanistan, obviously, but also the northwest part of Pakistan, specifically Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So we've seen a lot of fluctuation over the past 3 years. 2021, we saw over 350 attacks by ISK, which then slowly declined to over 200, and then in 2023, they only conducted 45 attacks, half of which were in Pakistan, the other were in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Now, this led many to be complacent about the threat, but what was still in existence was the underlying sources of ISK's strength. So what does this mean in terms of why would ISK then conduct or be linked to attacks in Moscow and Iran? So for those of us who have been observing ISK's propaganda, its narratives, ISK has long featured Russia and Iran as key adversaries. So it wasn't surprising that they would conduct these attacks. Perhaps what was surprising was their ability to do so soon after the Taliban regime's takeover. But how do these attacks, how do we make sense of them? How do they benefit ISK? So such attacks obviously raise ISK and Islamic State's brand internationally. And they also serve as a powerful signal to their constituents that, look, we actually deliver on the extreme narratives that we put out there. But I would also argue that attacks on Russia or in Iran serve an additional goal for ISK, which is really to unify its very diverse militant body, right, or the membership. So a Tajik member may not really care that much about some religious figure being targeted in northwest Pakistan. But what everyone can get behind is the targeting of these major powers, which ISK frequently claims that local governments are puppets of these larger states. So I would argue that it does serve that additional goal as well. Now, the Taliban, to give them credit, they have been targeting ISK, especially in 2023, which has contributed to the significant decline in ISK's attacks. However, we already know this from 20 years plus of experience that when you target top leaders or significant important leaders, it does constrain groups in the short term. But ISK, the Taliban, it lacks the capability to sustain these counterterrorism operations for obvious reasons. They lack resources, they have governance challenges. So the problem here is whether the Taliban can constrain ISK, its activities and its propaganda in the long term. And additionally, I think what ISK has benefited from is the Taliban's efforts to forge relations with major states such as Russia and Iran, which ISK points out, rightly so, that these contradict with what the Taliban used to say during the insurgency era. And I think showing this deviation of the Taliban in its current form has really benefited ISK. I do want to talk about ISK at the organizational level because I think under its operational strategy, under its current leadership is really important because ISK is actually currently adhering pretty strictly to the Islamic State's insurgency model. And its leader is actually quite prolific. He publishes a lot. In a recent book in 2023, he argues that ISK should stick to guerrilla warfare when it comes to Afghanistan because they're not yet ready to take over territorial control. But then within the propaganda, what we also see that he argues that what ISK should be doing is targeting religious figures, which we have seen ISK do, and also officials who may be unpopular with local populations, and then continue to strike within cities which have high security. So we've seen these elements within ISK's trajectory over the past 3 years. And finally, ISK, this happened pretty soon after the Taliban took over, immediately focused on recruiting from within the Central Asian population. So these are Tajik and Uzbek-speaking individuals within Afghanistan, but also nationals within their own countries, but perhaps more importantly, the Central Asian diaspora in Russia, Turkey, and in some European countries. And what we see in these narratives, various narratives, that ISK is inviting them to do hijrah and come to Afghanistan or help with conducting attacks overseas. And it has been very successful doing that. And the last comment I think I want to make is instead of sort of outlining what we can do to counter ISK, which I have done many times, I think over the last 2 decades, we have successfully developed a suite of kinetic operations, CVE, PVE, right, which we know when they work, when they might not work. In the context of South Asia, at least, I think what is really lacking are trust-building measures between countries, which allows them to implement these measures effectively. Because the focus is on great power competition and interstate rivalries, development, attention to civilians often takes the backseat. And so ISK and other groups like ISK continue to have populations to recruit from and exploit these grievances. So I think before we implement any counterterrorism operations or CVE, there really needs to be a lot more effort done between states to first build trust so that they can cooperate to tackle threats like ISK. I'll stop there.
Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. Well, a lot of very good points, very interesting points have already been made by the panelists, and just to make sure that we are all complementary and don't step on each other's toes, I will focus on the current state of the terrorist threat in Europe, focusing on non-state actors, but I already heard a lot of things that make me think that there's a lot of rejoinders in the follow-up questions or interventions. But just to set context when it comes to Europe, currently the terrorist threat level is rising, has been rising for about a year and a half already in many European countries, and that after a period of downturn, slowdown maybe in the terrorist threat between 2018 and 2022, where the threat remained high, but maybe all things compared, everything's always relative, a little bit lower compared to the period of ISIS caliphate. I think currently the threat can be deemed very high, serious, elevated, as we've heard from Deputy Director of FBI or NCTC Director, that was yesterday. And as a matter of fact, several European countries have now raised their threat level to the highest level or to the level that is just below the highest level, sometimes indicating that it wouldn't take much to actually get to the highest level. And that has been done, as I said, in several countries, in the aftermath of a series of attacks that have struck several countries, including Belgium and France, over the past few months, and also in the aftermath, obviously, of the 7 October attack and its aftermath, and the spillover effect that have been felt quite strongly in many places of the world, including in Europe, and that has led several countries to raise their threat level. And adding to that, you could also say that there's several European countries that are preparing for a number of major events that also add up to their concerns when it comes to terrorism, and basically talking about France organizing the Olympics this summer, or Germany organizing the football European Cup between June and July this year. So these are clearly, again, raising concerns in those countries about terrorism. So if you talk about the threat landscape, we're talking of a very diverse panorama, so to speak, of different groups and different ideologies. And really, it is not about one particular group or one particular ideology, but it really is the combination of all these threats together, most of those being rising currently, that really has led to this elevation of the threat level in Europe. We've heard earlier today several speakers actually talking about all these spinning plates, and I think that's where we are within counterterrorism, and also counterterrorism plus adding other threats that we are currently dealing with. So that's really what we are currently dealing with. Now, if I dig a little bit just deeper for just a couple of minutes, I will just highlight two particular threats that Europe is currently confronted with. Maybe say one word about a third one. But jihadi-inspired terrorism remains the main preoccupation for most European countries. There's been quite a few attacks over the past few months and years, a number of failed or foiled plots as well. Linking with what Amira was just saying, obviously ICCT has become the main focus of attention among security services in Europe. It is being estimated or assessed as the group that has the most capability, perhaps also the main willingness to either project or inspire attacks in the West. And we've heard a number of foiled plots, notably in France, Germany, Netherlands over the past few months. It's not the only one. Also, other groups, IS, Al Qaeda, IS, Syria and Iraq, Al Qaeda, still on everyone's mind. Not least because in Europe we still have what I call the caliphate's legacy. We still have a number of individuals that went to Syria and Iraq in the heydays, came back. Most of them don't necessarily represent a threat or a major threat nowadays, but a small number of them do. And they have the capabilities and they have the network to do something that could be highly problematic, plus the fact that we still have hundreds of Europeans in prisons and camps still in Syria that remain a factor of mobilization and radicalization for individuals in Europe. So that's one. The other threat that I wanted to highlight is right-wing extremism, and particularly right-wing violent extremism, which has been rising quite considerably over the past few years. And there's been quite a few plots that have been foiled, but also some successful attacks. Think of Bratislava a couple of years ago. That basically means that in some countries, right-wing violent extremism has now become on a par, seen as on a par to jihadi terrorism. And actually in some countries it has already surpassed jihadi terrorism, and right-wing extremism is considered now as the main terrorist threat in some European countries. As opposed to the jihadi threat, it comes mostly from lone actors, individuals groomed online, radicalized online, incited to commit something. Again, Bratislava is one example, and of course in Europe, Breivik is always like sort of the one thing that you want to avoid repeating. But there's also been a growing number of groups, organizations with structure, with some kind of leadership, with some kind of hierarchy that have been reaching out into new countries, that have been increasing their following. And I'm thinking of groups like the Base, Vorkrieg Division, Atomwaffen, Terrorgram. And these groups now actually represent really a very serious concern for a lot of countries, with also transnational connections, not necessarily leading to Afghanistan, rather leading to the other side of the Atlantic. That creates a bit of a different dynamic in counterterrorism there. But just to conclude on that, it has become a key priority for a lot of counterterrorism services in Europe. Germany, for instance, announced again that they were raising their level of priority, focusing on right-wing extremism. There's been a growing number of groups that have been proscribed across Europe. You've seen a growing number of arrests and also convictions. And I will stop here, but growing number of convictions, individual prosecuted and convicted for terrorism in relation to far-right terrorism. And that is not something you used to see that much in the past in Europe. So there is clearly an indication there and a growing willingness to tackle this phenomenon and to treat this phenomenon as terrorism. And I will stop here.
Thanks so much. I think one of the things that really strikes me, I think back to the first global security forum that we had here in Doha in 2018, and I've been lucky to be a part of all six. One held virtually during COVID, but the rest in person. And that 2018 forum was focused on foreign fighters. And the foreign fighters we were talking about were of a single variety. These were largely jihadists, right? Now we're up here, we're talking about a range of threats across the ideological spectrum, some state-sponsored, some not. And this is something that I've been writing about and speaking about for the past few years, which is the diversification of the threat, which I think makes it really difficult for counterterrorism and law enforcement and intelligence agencies to tackle. I'd like to start with a question for Marshall, and it has to do with the role that Wagner's playing in Africa. If you were back in government, what would you do to advise the administration of how to deal with this conundrum of dealing with what Declan Walsh from the New York Times has called the corridor of coups. So because of Leahy vetting and some of the other US policies, we're prevented from certain relationships with these governments. If we basically freeze them out, it's opening the door. We're saying, well, we can't deal with you because of a coup, but also don't deal with the Russians and Wagner. And they're kind of sitting there saying, well, what should we do? So is there some kind of a policy solution? I mean, I've written about this a little bit. I wrote a piece with Michael Shirkin for World Politics Review where we're essentially arguing that the US needs to be a little bit more creative in how we think about this. And I think sometimes we are flexible because if you look at what happened in Egypt, we don't call that a coup, but we're quick to point the finger at African governments. There's a bit of a double standard there. How do we kind of square that circle and deal with, what can be a very tough reality?
Thanks for that. I'm not sure the answer is to begin collaborating with units that have significant questions about their respect for human rights and discipline in the employment of force. However, there are a number of things that we were doing that are to some extent still happening that need to be intensified. I spent a lot of time in Sudan talking to the government there about the need to push Wagner out of the gold mines, that the concessions that they had awarded them there. They didn't do it. Wagner is not only continuing to maintain its grip on the gold mining process in Sudan, but is actually now directly involved in fomenting the division and the hostilities that are ripping that country apart. One of the key things to focus on, and this is also true, by the way, with regard to Hezbollah operations in certain countries, again, like the DRC, where Hezbollah is deep into the gold business as well. One of the reasons the Iranian network and the Russian network both favor gold mining is for a variety of reasons. First, the entire business process that surrounds the gold extraction industry, whether it's artisanal or full-up mining, is very cash intensive. And they like that because that gives them a variety of ways to pay off folks, to recruit people, and so on. But gold itself is very attractive because while it's heavy, it is portable, and it has a high degree of anonymity in terms of not really easily being able to tell where it came from once it's been refined. And of course, regimes that face either US or UK or EU sanctions, or the potential for sanctions, really do look to increase their gold reserves as a way of buffering their central banks against the effect of sanctions. So having their proxies out generating gold is to their advantage, which is why I will then conclude. First is we need to look at ways to get after the refining process, not just here, but it's a huge issue in Venezuela as well, where the Maduro regime is strip mining the pristine, well, what used to be pristine, putting huge amounts of mercury into the ground. But that gold, is going to Iran in exchange for weapons and other things, and so on. So focusing on the gold supply chain, and particularly the refining process. Qatar does not have any significant refining presence. The UAE certainly does. And then finally, this is, I was also, among many other hats during the Trump administration, I was president of the Financial Action Task Force. And we worked with countries across the world. Everyone here has a Financial Action Task Force body in which their country participates. Those anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism standards are crucial. And we want to encourage and should encourage governments to not only on paper adopt those standards, but actually implement them. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think really points well taken. I want to turn next to Ambassador Sales. And I often think that proxies are almost a natural byproduct of kind of US conventional military dominance. So for Iran, it makes no sense to even attempt to challenge the United States. So they try to do so asymmetrically, right? And they've tried to do this for a long time. For us, it doesn't really matter how we got into that situation. We still have to deal with it. What can the US do in particular, and other countries, to prevent Iran from building up its network of proxies to the point where they become the next Lebanese Hezbollah?
It's a great question. Hezbollah is sort of the gold standard when it comes to Iranian proxies. It has become a corrupt state within a state that has immiserated the Lebanese people, that has extracted enormous amounts of wealth from the economy, directed it towards its own corrupt purposes, that could have been devoted towards the betterment of the lives of the Lebanese people. And it's a cancer on the body politic of Lebanon. That's how we see it. In Tehran, they see it as a success story. Like this is the gold standard that we want to replicate again and again. And you see them pursuing the strategy in places like Yemen, where the Houthis are not just a terrorist organization that is threatening international shipping, they're also a source of domestic instability. I mean, it's Yemen, so there are degrees of instability that are sort of endemic, but it can always get worse. And the Houthis are doing their level best to make it worse. In Iraq, the government of Iraq for years has faced the destabilizing effects of militia groups that receive money from the Quds Force, that receive weapons from the Quds Force, that receive training, direction, and control from the Quds Force. They're not loyal to the central government in Baghdad the way the Iraqi army is loyal to the central government in Baghdad. And so this causes sectarian tensions in the country. It causes the diversion of resources, again, away from common national purposes to pursuing the interests of smaller, self-interested organizations like these militias. How do you stop Iran from doing it? Well, again, I want to go back to something I said in my opening remarks. If you want to stop Iran from doing this, you have to hold Iran responsible. You cannot play the game on Tehran's terms, in which Tehran invites us to close our eyes to the obvious fact that it's the puppet master that's really calling the shots and not simply the puppet. Now, I don't want to suggest that we should simply, ignore acts of aggression by the Houthis or by Kataib Hezbollah or by Lebanese Hezbollah or whatever the case may be. They are grown-ups. They are perfectly capable of being held accountable for their own malign actions. But we shouldn't stop there. Iran pursues this strategy because it believes, probably reasonably, based on past U.S. practice, because it believes that this is a low-cost way for it to achieve its strategic objectives. The way to stop it from doing that is to increase the cost to Iran of pursuing this strategy.
Yeah, it's a great return on investment, I think, from their vantage point in many ways. I wanted to ask Amira, you gave a really great overview of ISIS-K, and obviously it's a group that's in the news all the time now. And as you rightly noted, it's not a surprise that ISIS-K attacked Russia. They've been talking about it in their propaganda for years. They've now got this growing transnational footprint. What do you see, given all of your expertise and your excellent book on this topic, what's the trajectory of a group like ISIS-K? And you talked a little bit before about different factors and variables that have kind of gotten the group to where it is now. How could those factors or variables impact where you see this group going, I'd say, both in the kind of short term, but then in the longer term as well? Is this a group that has legitimate staying power, or is this a group that you can see fizzling out much in the way that arguably Al-Qaeda has? Although fizzling was due with, and I think if General Miller was here, he'd say there was a lot of effort putting into weakening and attenuating that group. With the switch from kind of counterterrorism to great power competition, is there a risk that this group will continue to kind of live on and be a major problem?
Thanks, Colin. That's a great question. Yes, so I think there are various factors which have allowed ISK to survive, resurge, and at times decline and become a really weakened organization only to rise up again, right? So just a reminder that ISK has now survived almost a decade in the region. That's a significant amount of time for a group to survive, and the longer these groups survive, the more tenacious they become. So I think the problem with ISK is that its underlying sources of power and the permissive environment that it exists within is still there. And this is something that I've argued, since the US withdrawal, is that ISK, within Afghanistan at least, despite the Taliban cracking down on ISK whenever they feel some international pressure and embarrassment, the environment within Afghanistan is the most permissive environment for ISK that it has ever been. So in the past, soon after its emergence in 2015 and onwards, I mean, it rose Its trajectory was rapid, and it's been ranked as one of the deadliest organizations in the world at least twice. The one thing which sort of made it decline significantly and lose its territory within Afghanistan was this constant pressure from the US, airstrikes, ground battles with the Afghan government, which was externally supported, and at the same time clashes with the Taliban. So all those forces combined finally constrained this group. And right now, all we have is the Taliban regime, which is not just fighting, it has to now govern a country as well. So it may, if it dedicated all of its resources to fighting ISK, then perhaps it may succeed in constraining the group. But that's not realistic, right? The other problem is, like I said, interstate rivalries. So whenever ISK conducts some attack, all the countries in the region start blaming each other. And the recent uptick in tensions between the Taliban regime and Pakistan has created even more opportunities for ISK, especially regarding its cross-border movement, because ISK, the territory which falls underneath is Afghanistan and also Khyber Pakhtunkhwa of Pakistan. So it operates on both sides of the borders, and it has alliances with groups which have also survived in the region for decades on both sides of the borders. It has tapped into sort of the pre-existing militant factions like IMU, which it again features in its propaganda even now, sort of reminding other Uzbek potential sympathizers that when IMU, or the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, initially members of it defected to the Taliban, this is how the Taliban responded and treated them and how they targeted some of these. So the broader landscape which has existed in the region, dating back to the 80s with the Cold War proxy wars, that's still very much in existence. You still have sectarian groups like Lashkar-e-Jhangvi. Of course, their agenda overlaps with ISK. So the general landscape, these interstate rivalries, I think, have really allowed ISK to sort of localize its jihad and really infuse local grievances very effectively with its global agenda, which we're increasingly seeing now. And I think even though the Taliban have denied many times that ISK is a threat, they have started a counter messaging strategy, which sort of indicates that actually they do see ISK as a potential threat. And I think this is just the reality in the region that there's a lot of underdevelopment and a lot of governments focus on their military budget and kinetic approaches. And as long as you do that, you will have populations across the region which are not happy with their governments. And then that is exactly what groups like ISK can easily exploit, and they're able to recruit and replenish their ranks even when we crack down on them.
Thank you. I think, this point about interstate rivalry and how that stokes some of these tensions and leads to a greater CT problem, to me, really kind of epitomizes the nexus of great power competition and counterterrorism, which I've argued for the past couple of years. We don't truly understand great power competition. If we're making it into what Director Abizaid called, I think, a false choice, and I think I've used that same term, it's not an option. It's not we're going to do CT or we're going to engage in strategic competition. We can and we must do both, and I think the areas where we see this most poignantly are probably the Sahel in Africa and then parts of Central and South Asia, where these factors are kind of leading into this really vicious cycle. So, Thomas, the ICCT has done, I think, some of the best work on Russia's role in stoking far-right extremism. You guys had a really big project going back to last year that you briefed. I think a lot of people in the U.S. counterterrorism community were impressed by that work. Can you talk a little bit about some of that research and Russia's role in kind of stoking far-right extremism in Europe, and what might we expect going forward?
Sure. And thanks for highlighting our work. First, maybe just saying one word on what you said just earlier on terrorism and great powers rivalry. I think what strikes me is that we all recognize that terrorism is politics. Terrorism is a sort of a political phenomenon. Sometimes we forget somehow that counterterrorism is also politics. And so therefore, as you have indeed this sort of return to great powers rivalry, you do have a sort of a greater emphasis on the fact that counterterrorism also has to be seen and conceived in this context of great powers politics. Anyway, that was just a small parenthesis. Indeed, in Europe, you have a number of, we've had for a long, long time state-sponsored terrorist activities. It's been mentioned before. I mean, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran, they've been active on European soil for a while. But the one actor that maybe we were a little bit overlooking, if not closing our eyes on, I mean, I don't know why really, but we were not looking at Russia as a state actor that is really proactively reaching out to far-right extremists and far-right violent extremists, partly with strategic objectives in line with their military doctrine of political warfare, information warfare, partly just to disrupt the West from the inside, basically. That is part of their disruption strategy, sort of weaken the West from the inside. And there's been quite a lot of reports recently. There are some intelligence services that came out publicly in the press, or at least the press echoed some of their concerns about, quote-unquote, Russia proactively recruiting far-right extremists to conduct operations in Europe. There's been the Czech intelligence services that came out to unveil a massive corruption and disinformation campaign operated from Moscow ahead of the elections, the European elections that will be held next month in Europe. So all of that does point to the fact that Russia has been playing a role, sometimes visibly, oftentimes invisibly, to try to reach out to this community. In the book that we just published, and which, by the way, is available on for free to download on our website. Not a lot of books are for free.
My favorite kind of books, the free ones.
Exactly. So go on our website. But in short, we look at 10 different countries and we identify 10 different patterns of Russian influence over far-right extremism across Europe. And I will not, dig into details in all of these 10 different patterns. I mean, it includes basically bribery and corruption. It includes training militias or violent groups. It includes facilitating connection between Russia-supported groups like Russian Imperial Movement and European far-right violent militias. There's a lot of different patterns through which Moscow can sort of have an impact on these groups. But the most important part, I think, just to summarize our findings, is two things. One is Moscow is trying to support all disruptive elements that it can support across Europe and across the ideological spectrum, but including in the far right. And they will do that directly and they will do that indirectly. And the second point is Russia will do that directly, but it's also a bi-directional type of influence. So interestingly, you also have far-right violent extremist groups or individuals that look up to Russia as basically an alternative model, as a source of inspiration. And basically they are fed, they live on Russian propaganda, Russian disinformation, because they really believe that another reality is possible and that basically it's worth pursuing that reality through violent means. And so just to conclude on that part, I think one of the key conclusions we have in our book and in our research is that it is important to continue working on far-right violent extremism because it's a rising threat, as I was saying in my opening remarks. But you cannot think that phenomenon anymore in abstraction of other external actors and forces, including and particularly Russia as an influence on that movement.
We've only got 6 minutes left, so sorry to lob what I think is going to be a big grenade onto the table, but we've talked a lot about Russia, but we haven't really focused on China yet. And I wonder if in the 5 minutes and 51 seconds we have left, we should perhaps not exhaustively cover the topic of China's use of proxies. So I haven't done anything remotely resembling a systematic study of this.
There's a great piece in Defense One by yours truly and Molly Saltskog on this topic. Just came out yesterday.
Okay, I swear we didn't coordinate this in advance, although it may look like it. The Chinese are really good at disinformation. They're really good at using things like the Confucius Institutes at American universities to spread narratives that are favorable to the Chinese Communist Party and that are disfavorable to the perceived enemies of the Chinese Communist Party. And the Chinese are also very good at using private companies, or what might appear to be private companies, to advance the interests of the party state. Think, for example, of Huawei building 5G networks globally that also conveniently can be used to collect information on an industrial scale. Or think, for instance, of TikTok, an issue that is very salient back in Washington these days. To one, spread Chinese Communist Party friendly narratives, to collect information that can be used for various intelligence or other state purposes. We haven't really seen the CCP do is what Iran has done and what Russia has done. That is to say, using proxies to conduct kinetic operations. Will we see that? I don't know. I do know in other spheres we're seeing convergence between these American rivals and rivals to not just the United States, but to the United States and our allies and the world order that we have shaped and from which we all benefit. China and Russia have proclaimed a no-limits partnership. So I don't know if I'm copying any of the material in your, I'm sure, excellent piece, but I would watch closely to see if there are further areas of convergence between China and these other members of the axis of whatever we're calling it.
I mean, you teed the piece up perfectly. The question essentially is, what, if anything, has China learned from Iran and Russia about the use of proxies and PMCs? And so, yeah.
No, I just wanted to, I mean, it's an excellent point, and the one thing that I was going to say is simply, I think earlier today, I think it was the colleague from NYPD talked about transnational repression, which is indeed a growing concern for a lot of countries as well. And on that regard, there was an interesting piece in Le Monde today about basically Chinese, not so discreet transnational repression operations in the heart of Paris, basically with these informal police stations and basically in daylight operations to arrest and try to send back to China dissidents and Uyghurs. And some people would call that transnational repression. Some people would call that not state-sponsored terrorism, it's state terrorism, because it is about creating fear among opponents or potential opponents.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on time, so as the last panel of the day, I want to thank everybody for sticking with us. Really appreciate your time and your attention, and thank you to our panelists as well. Really learned a lot, and I mean that, so thanks so much, and thanks to everybody for another great day. Hard to believe it's over, so thank you.